Welcome everyone once again to this course, Development Economics 2. The current unit is called Economic Activity and Climate Change, and this is the first lecture of this unit. So, what are we are going to learn in this lecture? First of all, we will be learning about the concept and notion of climate change in the context of economic activity. Secondly, we will be introduced to various aspects of climate change. Thirdly, we will be discussing the interrelationship between climate change and economic activity. And finally, we will be introduced to the notion of environmental Kuznet's curve. Now, to start with, what is climate change, right? So, many of you must be knowing about the notion of climate change already. So, what is climate change? Climate change is basically change in the usual or average weather of a place, right? So, climate is different from weather, right? So, weather is just usual day-to-day condition outside, and climate on the other hand is the average condition of a place, right? Like Thought Desert is generally hot and dry, right? Cherrapunji is generally wet, it rains most of the time in the year, right? So these are the climate of these places. So climate change refers to the notion that usual weather of these places are being changed, right? Now, climate change can be true for both local area and also it is true globally, meaning the average weather of the globe or planet Earth is getting changed. Now, why is this happening, right? The main reason behind climate change is referred to as the economic activity by human beings, right? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says in its fourth status report that the current rise in temperature, 90% of this rise can be attributed to human economic activity, right? So why does climate change happen, right? So the main reason behind this is thought to be the use of fossil fuel as energy and emitting carbon in the atmosphere as a result of it, right? So in the earlier research, it was observed that the average temperature of the planet Earth is rising, right? So this phenomena was named as global warming. We were all talking about global warming, like 20 years back, but now it is realized by the environmentalists and scientists that this emission is not just affecting global temperature, it is also affecting other aspects like wind, snow, ice, usual temperature of a place, right? The water composition of water, so on and so forth. So a wider plethora of environmental indicator is getting disequilibrium position, right? So this is the notion of climate change. IPCC in its sixth report, you may say, what is IPCC? IPCC is basically Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is an UN body. It is supported by more than 190 nations around the world, and it is basically a group of many environmentalists and researchers which does extensive research on the topic of climate change, and it brings out facts about climate change and it suggests policies on climate change. So there are many conclusions in the sixth status report of IPCC, but I want to mention three main points here. First of all, scientific evidence that human economic activity is the prime reason behind the current phase of climate change is compelling. There is no doubt about it. And also, the report says that the effect of climate change is rapidly intensifying, and there is no sign of the pattern to be reversed very soon unless we drastically change our economic policies. Thirdly, the current level of climate change mitigation policy is not enough to address the problem, right? So what is the science behind it, right? So we have to look at the energy that is received by planet Earth from the sun, and this Earth receives this energy in form of radiation, right? And some of this energy is trapped in the atmosphere by some gases. These gases are basically carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen dioxide, so on and so forth, right? So these gases have the property of capturing heat in themselves, right? So this energy is captured by these gases in our atmosphere, and it works like a blanket on planet Earth which gets warm. So this is called greenhouse effect. And remember, greenhouse effect in itself is not harmful, right? So without this greenhouse effect, the average temperature of Earth would have been around -18 degrees Celsius, and the Earth couldn't have supported life on it, right? So greenhouse effect is fine, but what is problematic is the higher concentration than required of these gases in our atmosphere, right? So greenhouse gases are getting more and more concentrated in our atmosphere, which is capturing more heat than required in our atmosphere. And this is the reason of global warming and in turn climate change. So what are the effects of climate change? So as a result of climate change, we are seeing higher concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. We are seeing polar caps being melted. As a result, sea level is rising. Arctic sea ice area is getting shrinked, and also the glaciers around the world are retreating. The area covered by the glaciers are retreating. Now here is a question for you. How does climate change affect human society and planet Earth? Now let us look at some aspects of climate change, right? So how does climate change, actually affecting us and the planet Earth, right? So first of all, let us look at this diagram which depicts the local temperature in 2019 relative to the average temperature between 1951 and 1980. So we are comparing temperature in 2019 as relative to the average temperature between 1951 and 1980, right? So let us look at this diagram. This is showing two things, right? First of all, we must know that the average temperature increase around the world is just 1 degree Celsius. Now, 1 degree centigrade might seem very insignificant to some of you, but remember, this is just the average. It is not everywhere at the same time, right? So first of all, this graph is showing that the land temperature has increased more than the water level temperature, right? So for example, where water level temperature has increased around 0.56 degrees Celsius, the average land temperature has increased by more than 1.8 degrees Celsius, right? Secondly, we can see that the increase in temperature is much higher in the polar regions. As we can see here that in some polar regions, the temperature has increased more than 5 degrees Celsius as well. So this has a very significant effect. This means that polar ice caps are melting faster than ever before, and this is resulting in rapid increase in sea level rise, right? Now this diagram is showing a particular aspect from the 6th status report of the IPCC. So this is basically showing that we have a pledged target of achieving 2.1 degree Celsius by 2100, by the year 2100. Now the current policies, if we stick to the current policies, we will be reaching around 2.9 degrees Celsius by that time, which is 0.8 degrees Celsius higher than what we have set as target. And if we don't take much climate actions, then the increase in temperature might go as high as up to 4.8 degrees Celsius. So what is the takeaway from this? It is the fact that the current climate mitigation policies are not enough, and we have to do more in terms of combating climate change. Now let us discuss a very important aspect of climate change. It is the fact that the causes and impact of climate change are highly inequitable. What do we mean by that? We mean by this is the first fact is that the persons or the groups of people who have caused or are causing climate change the most are also the most privileged in terms of economic affluence, social class, and gender. And on the other hand, those who are bearing the severest brunt of climate change are the most disadvantaged. They are most likely to be poor, they are most likely to be socially backward, and also to be women. And this pattern can be observed in all levels, like in local areas, inside countries, and also around the globe. Now here's another question for you. What are the ways the environment enable the economy? The economy and environmental systems are highly interconnected and interdependent systems, and both have impact on economic and social development. So this diagram, as you can see, depicts the interrelationship between the economic system and the environmental system. As we can see here, the economic system is completely contained within the environmental system, and in turn environmental system is just a part of the rest of the universe, from where the environmental system receives energy in terms of solar energy mostly. Now how does the economic system and the environmental system interacts with each other? So first of all, we can see here that production by farms produce goods and services by receiving labor from the consumers and households. It receives capital from the capital stocks, and most importantly in this context, it receives natural resources from the environmental system, right? And using all this, it produces goods and services. Some of these goods and services are consumed by the households. Some of it is being reinvested in terms of the capital stock, and the rest of it, which is waste or byproduct, some of this waste gets recycled, and whatever is not being recycled goes back to the environmental system as waste, right? So environmental system functions as a waste sink here, right? On the other hand, households and consumers enjoy environmental amenities, which is basically natural beauty, so on and so forth. And most importantly, the environmental system provides a combination of conditions which supports life on the planet Earth, including human life. So, for example, concentration of oxygen, gravity, so on and so forth, these things enable life on planet Earth. Now, let us discuss about the natural resource provision by the environmental system. So, we can classify natural resources by exploring couple of questions, and with the help of these questions we can categorize these natural resources. So, first of all, we can ask, does the current use of a resource affect future availability of that resource? If the answer is no, so for example, if we use solar energy today or wind energy, it does not affect solar energy or the supply of solar energy or wind energy tomorrow, right? So these resources are called flow resources, right? Now, what if the answer is yes? What if the current use of a resource affects the availability of the resource in future, right? For example, fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are not unlimited, right? So, use of fossil fuel today affects the supply of fossil fuels tomorrow. So, if the answer to this question is yes, then we can term the resource as stock resource. Now we can ask another question. Does the stock resource regenerate itself? If the answer is yes, for example, there are some the supply of animal species or the supply of fish in the ocean and so on and so forth. If we use them within a limit, the stock of this resource have a ability to replenish themselves, right? So unless we don't harvest them too much, they can replenish themselves and increase their availability, right? So they can regenerate themselves. These kind of resources are called renewable stock resources. And if the answer is no, obviously, for example, once again, fossil fuels, use of fossil fuels, the fossil fuels cannot regenerate themselves. So these kind of resources are called non-renewable stock resources. The second function of the environmental system is to provide life support. As we have discussed, conditions like temperature, gravity, concentration of oxygen in the air, all these things enable the life system on the planet Earth, right? So this is a very basic enabling system that environmental system provides. Secondly, amenity services. So environment provides some conditions, some scenic beauties or some areas which can be used by human beings for leisure and enjoyment. For example, one might like to swim in the river, one might like to look at the scenic beauty of mountains, so on and so forth. These are amenity services that is being provided by the environmental system. And finally, but very importantly, environmental systems function as a waste sink to the economy, right? Household and firms necessarily generate waste, right? We have to be very particular about this point. The fact that economic activity, use of natural resource for economic activity necessarily generates waste, right? Because of a law in physics called law of conservation of mass, which basically says you cannot use of a matter, you can only transform the matter, right? If you are using a environmental resource, you cannot destroy it. You can only transform inputs into outputs, and in some stage it has to go back to the nature again, right? So generating waste is a necessary condition for using natural resource as inputs for economic activity, right? So these two functions, resources, natural resource and waste sink, these two functions can be thought of as complementary functions. If we use natural resources, then we will be producing some waste, right? Now, one very important point about this is the fact that these four functions of environmental system is not independent to each other. Let us take the example of climate change itself, right? So we use natural resource as fossil fuel for production of energy, right? And this activity produces carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and we basically dump this or emit these byproducts into the atmosphere, right? So this shows how the natural resource function is interconnected to the waste sink function, and as a result of this we experience something called climate change. Now climate change in turn affects all these functions, right? So for example, climate change, as a result of climate change, we are seeing drastic changes or fluctuations in life enabling features of the nature. For example, we are seeing drastic changes in temperature and so on and so forth, and this is disturbing the biodiversity of the ecosystem, right? And secondly, as a result of climate change, the supply of amenities to human beings can also be reduced. For example, due to heat wave and ice cap melting, so on and so forth, the amenity services are also being affected by climate change. Climate change also affects the supply of natural resources, and it also affects the nature's or environment's ability to absorb waste or to function as the waste sink of the economy. So in all these ways, all these four functions are interconnected to each other. Now here is another question for you to think. How does economic growth affect environmental quality? In this section, we will be looking at the relationship between economic activity and the environmental quality through the lens of something called environmental Kuznet's curve hypothesis, right? So what is environmental Kuznet's curve? This hypothesis basically says there is a inverted U-shaped relationship between economic activity or economic growth and environmental degradation. Meaning, in the initial phase of economic growth, the level of environmental degradation increases along with increase in per capita income. And at a later stage, after some point, the relationship starts getting reversed. Along with economic growth, environmental quality improves. So why does this happen? What is the logic behind it? So the basic reason behind it is that in the initial phase of income growth, people prioritizes income growth more than the environmental quality. And after a certain level, achieving certain level of income, they start valuing in the environment they are living in more and more. As a result, they take actions in terms of restructuring production, adopting new technologies, pressurizing government, so on and so forth. And as a result, environmental quality starts improving, right? So this relationship is popularly known as environmental Kuznets curve. So the original Kuznets curve is actually a relationship between income growth and the level of inequality, and this concept is very similar to that, and that's why this name has been borrowed from Kuznets curve and it has become environmental Kuznets curve. This curve also shows a transformation from a mostly agriculture based economy to an industrial economy, and in this phase the environmental degradation increases, and when the economy further transforms from an industrial structure to a more service focused economy, the environmental quality starts improving. So this is the basic logic behind environmental Kuznets curve. Finally, the take-home points of this lecture are as follows. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges facing humanity today, and economic activity has a lot to do with it. Secondly, climate change threatens sustainability of the development path of the human society, which we are currently enjoying. Causes and impacts of climate change are inequitable. This is a very important point. The environment enables the economic system in various ways. And finally, we have been introduced to the idea of environmental Kuznets curve. Thank you. I will see you in another lecture.